Hello and welcome to the 2021 JoLLE at UGA Winter Conference. The theme for this conference was conceived in the context of a deadly pandemic that continues to rage and in the swirl of very important racial justice movements of our time. For JoLLE, the themes of community, accountability, and racial solidarity surfaced as key to understanding the pressing language and literacy issues of our time. It's my pleasure, as well as a great point of pride, to be able to help support the stellar social justice-oriented graduate student-run journal. A great deal of gratitude also to the recently retired Dr. Peter Smagorinsky, who has supported the journal and mentored students since its inception and been involved in the planning of this conference as well. Many thanks to all the wonderful board members of JoLLE who have helped make this happen, the wonderful affiliated staff, as well as faculty and also audience members. We are so grateful for your presence. And last but not least, many thanks to our incredibly inspiring keynote speakers, Dr. Yolanda Celi Ruiz, who will be talking about the importance of enacting critical love and fostering anti-racism, as well as Dr. K. Wayne Yang, who will be talking about how to honor ancestors who are not our own in order to build solidarity within the literacy community. My own talk will focus on my own journey in arriving at a different understanding, a more multi-layered understanding of the importance of justice and community building within the field of literacy and language education. The title of my talk is "You Must Make the Injustice Visible: The Importance of Building Community and Solidarity in Language and Literacy Education." And to those of you who don't know me, my name is Usree Bhattacharya. I'm an assistant professor in the language and literacy education at the University of Georgia, and the new faculty advisor on the board of JoLLE. So very grateful to be here. And when the students approached me to give the welcome address at JoLLE, I started thinking about what justice means to me, and I approached it from the perspective of looking at justice and thinking about language and literacy in justice. And so I did what I went to where my comfort zone is, which is kind of thinking about India's history. India is my homeland and the land where I grew up. And I went to my own inspirations, and I paused on this particular quote, and it helped me clarify what I think what I want to talk about here, and what I think is critical in language and literacy education, which is making justice visible. So Gandhiji, in a very famous interview, in a photo essay with Margaret Burke-White with Life magazine, spoke about the importance of making injustice visible. He said, "You must make the injustice visible." And here I reflect on how my own educational language justice orientations have been the cornerstone of the work I've done, but also in how it's evolved for me. So I'm going to begin with my community, my core community over the last 13 years, where my research has been centered, which is back home in India. And so about in 2007, during a visit home from grad school and from Berkeley, and I was, I just arrived and I just had maybe 3-4 weeks, and my mom said to me one night, there's this wonderful orphanage of these wonderful kids, and you're gonna go with me, please come with me. And I said, no, I did not want to go to an orphanage because I didn't want to be sad, and I didn't want to feel helpless, and it was my vacation, and I didn't want to deal with the trauma that I knew was going to be in that space. And so I caved to my mom. She asked me several times, and then I will never regret that she, in fact, I mean, I could not be more grateful that she prodded me so many times. And I entered that space in 2007, and my work there continues even today. So the space which ended up becoming my dissertation site, as well as the site for my most of my research that I've done in my career, involved these 25 kids. It's a revolving population because kids come and go, ages ranging between 5 through 17, grades ranging kindergarten through 10th. There was an Anath Ashram, the orphanage administrator, and Anath Ashram assistants, and others who were also part of this study. But of course, at the heart are these boys, young boys, at the Anath Ashram, or the orphanage. I also did research in the school, and this was within the village nearby. It had students between the ages of around, again, 5 and 17, pre-K through class 12th. The village itself had a population of about 2,000. The school identified as English medium, and there was a principal and 5 teachers, and it's a very small space, so there were between 2 and 3 classes simultaneously in that one space. And it basically catered to the demand for English medium instruction among day laborers and maids. So for the purpose of this talk, I started thinking, how do I think about what my work has entailed there? And I started going through the most of the work that I've published there, and it surfaced to me that injustice and justice have been the foundation on which this work has been built. So for example, in mediating inequalities, I looked at how the instructional medium served to make not only content, but also language inaccessible to these underprivileged kids. And this was because the teachers themselves were not very familiar with English. And so they relied on a lot of rote instruction, rote learning, so memorizing without really imbibing. And this set up a cycle where kids were not understanding what they were reading. And so not only did they not acquire the language, but they also did not acquire a lot of the content. So the English medium there became a vehicle through which all these inequalities became hardened. The socioeconomic disparities became hardened because these were the poor kids who were receiving instruction in a way that kept them from acquiring English and being able to thus access content. I also explored colonization and English ideologies, which within the orphanage, there was a lot of anxiety around English and its role within the colonial context, and the kind of pushback and the anger against the role of English within colonization that I heard was very different than what is typically heard at the policy levels, that everybody wants to learn English and nobody has any problem with it. That was not the case, as I found within the orphanage context. I also looked at the Right to Education Act, which was enacted a few years ago, which for the very first time opened up educational access as a fundamental right to Indian citizens, and looked at the complexity of addressing multilingualism within this context. And I showed that while the goals of the Right to Education Act were well-meaning, they were not setting up multilingual learners for success in the ways that they needed to in order to ensure success, particularly for minoritized language communities. I also looked at imagined communities, inclusion and ideology in Indian textbooks, and this came to me when I started seeing this particular lesson across different levels that the kids at the orphanage were looking at and learning for school. And I noticed that there was a lot of there was this particular lesson about that showed an image of a school that had absolutely nothing to do with their own realities. So they were reading about swimming pools and badminton courts in a school, whereas in their own school, there were 3 different classes crammed into one, while the teacher taught 3 classes simultaneously because they did not have enough space, and they didn't have a garden, they had no lawn, they had no place to play. And so the reality really was in conflict. And and I thought about what does it mean for how the children see themselves as learners and as citizens of India, and how they think about these socioeconomic differences as manifested within their own textbooks. I also thought about discitizenship, how using a critical disability studies lens, how children, when they experience being cut off, being cut off from language and content, in what ways it cuts them off from being able to exercise their own civic duties and their ability to access civic rights. Finally, I also looked at how the kids resisted English, and I mentioned colonization was part of the piece, a part of the resistance, but there were other reasons why the kids also, showed that they were that this relationship with English was complex and filled with a lot of turmoil. And so the thread through all this is equity. Kind of thinking about equity. How are these practices? How are these contexts equitable for these poor learners? These learners who are living in impoverished contexts and dealing with a variety of different marginalizing forces, but also fundamentally a question of justice. Not only do we look at the problem, but how do we make it so that they have an equal playing field? I next slowly started evolving to kind of thinking about my own voice, and this, comes from being told by a journal, that I should be writing, it should be submitting to Indian journals and not, journals within the U.S., or that I should be, just considering that I wasn't. That I didn't really belong here. And there are just too many stories to go into in this short welcome address. But one of the places this took me to was to think about my own association, which was the American Association for Applied Linguistics. And I've been there so many times, and yet that one time, I think it was 2015 or 2016, and it just came to me how few people of color I saw there in that space. And so working with Lei Jiang, one of my graduate assistant at the time, and then Suresh Kanagaraja, my mentor, we came together to see what the numbers were within our association. So what did it look like in terms of who's within the institutional structures of power? Who is being awarded within the organization? So just pulling out some numbers here, we started seeing that AAAL leadership members, there were only 19% who were people of color. Only 7.5% of presidents had ever been people of color. The Distinguished Service and Scholarship Awards Committee members, which were just 8% of that. All the editors of the entire editorial board, for as long as we could find the information for it, not one person had ever, in its history that we could find, had ever been a person of color. So the entire board of the editorial board of the journal, there's just nobody who was a person of color, and it had not occurred to anybody to ask why. And then there were others like strand coordinators. There were just, for the convention, there were just 10%. Plenary speakers were a mere 15% of color. Invited colloquia chairs were even worse at 7.5%. And so, and one of the things that also was disheartening was to find that one of the most prestigious awards given by the association is the Distinguished Service and Scholarship Award. And in its 22-year history at the time, no person of color had ever been awarded that. And so that year I nominated Dr. Suresh Kanagaraja, who was part of this effort, and with the assistance of people much more senior to me, about 50 people, we nominated him, and he ended up winning that year, breaking that very terrible cycle where not a single person of color had been awarded. And so that was when I started, seeing how one could start moving towards change, that it wasn't enough to just call out injustice, but to start thinking about, where to take that energy, and that, how to build that community in a way that we can, create a momentum and a movement towards something better, and a more just and equitable space for scholars like me, and anybody else who might feel marginalized within American academia. Around this time, just a little bit later, my world came to a standstill. So my baby girl at the time, she's 5 now, Kalika, was diagnosed with this rare disorder called Rett syndrome, R-E-T-T, Rett syndrome. And I've grown up very multilingual, as is my husband, and with very different languages. Having a child who was speaking 2 languages, and then suddenly one day she just stops talking, and one day just starts clapping and cannot stop clapping her hands, and so can't hold a toy, can't push a toy, can't hold a spoon, can't hug. There were the entire spectrum of things that you could do with your hands was suddenly robbed from my daughter. So this is a very rare genetic condition. It occurs in approximately 1 in 10 to 15,000 live births, and it comes with a variety of different, very terrifying comorbidities, such as seizures, breathing disturbances, scoliosis. And so the 2 things that, were probably the hardest for me to take would be the fact that suddenly my daughter would never speak a word again to me. And then the other thing, which was that she would never be able to use her hand. And so the biggest question for me at that time was, what is language? What is literacy? How will she navigate a world if she cannot communicate? And so that night, I started I went to Google Scholar, and I looked for, research on this. And the only word I could find, and little, references to Rett syndrome, entailed the word ineducable. And I was horrified and shocked and thought, I did not even know this word existed, and I have a PhD in education. How can I have a daughter? How can anybody be called ineducable? And so that led me to starting research on, with my daughter, with my daughter. So it was just a few months later that I began. I have a variety of wonderful students who are with me on this journey, doing research with me. My students, Vishnu, Singh, Lei has been part of some of the studies, and one of the studies, and then Kaylee, and Thea and Olivia, and of course also Dr. Tarquinio, who is Kalika's Rett specialist. And we've been working, we're already writing, some of our projects have been published. And what began as a very simple question, what is language and literacy, took me to and my students to a path of thinking very, at the very basics, what is language, what is literacy? And so we started looking at Kalika's hand movements, or intentional hand movements, her eye movements, her positioning of the body, the way she kisses a book or leans in, all those kinds of things, how they reflect and enact literacy practices. And then one of the things, very soon after, I think it was like 2-3 months after her diagnosis, I was told there was this magical device called an eye tracking device that tracks the eyes of a person. So it's like, having a mouse, you're having your eyes act like a mouse, and you control the computer screen. And it's completely revolutionary, very expensive, so not accessible to very many people in the world. But we were very lucky that Kalika received the device, and she has speech software in it. So she's able to speak by, remembering what pages she has, and having to navigate hundreds of different words in hundreds of different places every single day at 5, knowing that if she has to talk, she has to work really hard at it. And I'll show you an example of that. But here you see Kalika actually smiling as she's looking and drawing with her eyes. And then, of course, literacy practices where she's smiling with me or pulling up a pop-up book with her lips. And this is kind of taken over time. But to get back to the issue of justice and injustice, injustice to me was to the construction of entire groups of individuals with significant disabilities as ineducable, to say that they had IQs of infants, to call them nonverbal, even though they have so much to say in so many different ways that we don't actually recognize. So I've been part of this research that tracks, that looks at eye tracking. There has never been a research that looks at eye tracking for communication within Rett syndrome. In fact, there is almost nothing outside of Rett syndrome either. So we've been thinking about what at the heart of it all is literacy engagement. When we take away ability to talk, when we take away ability to turn a page and to show engagement in typical ways. Alongside my students, I've also thought about representation in children's literature. That was with Alex Lamp-Berkland, and thinking about caregiver perspectives, how parents construct different notions around the disease. The language of self-advocacy, which is so very important to me, Kalika having a virtual meeting with her doctor, and the first thing she says to him through her eye tracker is, "Do help." And that advocacy extends in a variety of different contexts. And we want to capture that because it's not just about capturing the fact that somebody can talk with their eyes, but it is how much they have inside of them to say, and also to note the ways in which they can self-advocate for themselves and be, reach that level of independence that is always this elusive thing, especially within Rett syndrome. More recently, I've started thinking about decolonizing Rett research. It is a very wide space. It doesn't have room for multilingualism, bilingualism. It has not much room for anybody who, really looks like me. And so that's the other part of it that I'm trying to thread through all this. And but really, I think one of the things I'm really aspiring to do with this research, with my team, is to think importantly about issues of communication and cognition that recognize the humanity of a child, the humanity of an individual, and recognize that everybody is educable. And so I'll give you an example of what that looks like with my daughter. So recently we were talking about, I got her a couple of books on the president, the new vice president, and here is Kalika and I. So I ask her, Kalika, who's the president? And she looks at her tracker and then responds to me. She's on her occupation page and she has to pick the word president. She has to know to pick the word president. She has to know that the president is the answer, but also actually find it on her page and then trigger it with her eyes. So here's an example. Oops. Who is Joe Biden? President. So this is just kind of goes to show that, how we're challenging notions of language and literacy that don't have room for people like Kalika who speak with their eyes and speak in different ways typically. We want to be pushing the boundaries of thinking about our body and the ways in which it is supremely capable, whether one is disabled or not. And we want to be thinking about constraints and affordances that are available to everybody, regardless of what shape their body takes. The idea of community and solidarity has been important to me for language and literacy socialization research, not only because I want as many people as possible creating, a body of work that challenges what I saw that night after diagnosis. I also know that it will take millions of dollars to cure my daughter, to provide a treatment for my daughter, as our main advocacy organization, Rett Syndrome Research Trust, is trying to do. I cannot get to those millions of dollars. Just a few thousands of us, within the community of Rett syndrome, caregivers, or, we are not going to get to that mark. We need for society to be invested in children who are this deeply impacted and in individuals who are this deeply impacted. And we need for people to care about people on the very extreme edges of the ability spectrum and recognize not only the number of different ways in which they are able and focus on those particular ways, but also to recognize that it is in our common good to be invested in everybody. So I want not only that just society and educational context for Kalika, but I need for society to care about Kalika and for everyone who suffers like her with significant disabilities, but also those who are marginalized for any other reason. And so I need a just educational context. And to kind of end on this note, I want to provide a little bit more context for the title of the talk, that you must make the injustice visible. Here's the fuller quote from Gandhi: "What you cannot do is accept injustice from Hitler or for anyone. You must make the injustice visible and be prepared to die like a soldier to do so." Now, I'm not saying that this is the way to go, and neither is Gandhi, actually. He clarifies that, the idea is not to accept injustice. And he does say that, he does frame it within a militaristic context by using the term soldier. But what he means is that no matter what happens, you cannot accept injustice. And it is important to have this entire larger framing in mind, and to kind of think that, you know, regardless of our notions about justice and injustice, what is absolutely unimpeachable is that justice must live, and for that we have to absolutely accept nothing less than that. So I hope these conversations that will ensue will allow us to build a community in solidarity in language and literacy education, and allow us to help make a path for those who've been marginalized due to race, gender, nationality, disability, or any other perceived identity marker. Whatever happens, we cannot accept injustice, and in our work, we must make it visible. And we will need to make our own personal journeys to justice. I wish I didn't arrive at this, knowing, understanding the gap in disability studies, the deficit orientation in disability studies from outside, until I had a daughter who had such profound, a profound disorder and disease. I wish I'd made that journey earlier. But regardless of how we get there, we have to make those personal journeys, and we must embrace those journeys. We must push ourselves so we make these journeys outside of our comfort zones, like it took for me to go into that anath ashram during a vacation, or to try to build a research in Rett syndrome. But this is also a journey that must be made together. So welcome, and hope you have a wonderful conference. Thank you.